Did you know that over 71,000 people checked out our free resources last year, like the live and recorded versions of our Thursday webinars? We're glad you're here today. And as you will quickly discover, today's webinar truly celebrates all that we have learned in the past 20 years. And it turns out all that we've learned in the past 20 years comes in really handy when there's things like the coronavirus. And we literally did an about face this week when we saw what was happening and reached out to our experts in our ThirdPath community to get them to join us for today's webinar and share the wisdom that they've learned around what you can do right now, today, to better manage this massive change that is already here and going to get bigger in changing our work and lives. So to do that, we have 3 different viewpoints on today's webinar, and we'll have a live Q&A at the end for those who were able to join today. You'll get to ask all of our experts questions too. We have Rob Hickox. He is awesome. I'm going to be meeting him for the first time, but have known his wife, Michelle Hickox, for a long time. He's one of the first persons to manage a remote team in his organization. So obviously has a lot of expertise for us around remote work that we're going to be tapping today. I've also asked one of my employees to join us today. Obviously, ThirdPath is an expert in remote work, but Melissa is going to talk about how it's not just what's happening at work, it's also what's happening at home that's going to help us better manage these uncharted waters around a pandemic and the coronavirus. So Melissa, I'm so glad you're here today too. And if that's not good enough, we also have Delta Emerson, a longtime friend and ThirdPath supporter. She's got so much wisdom around these issues, lots of long-term expertise, and she'll be talking about what organizations can be doing and are already doing to help people manage these kinds of changes so it's working well for the business and the employees. What I want to start with, though, is some background information. If you've been on a webinar before, you've seen that we always talk about different jobs have different solutions. Today, we're looking at how remote work is an excellent option for many people when we face this upcoming problem around the coronavirus. Because remote work allows us to work in our own homes, and that's good for 1,000 reasons. But as you can imagine, there are some people who can't do remote work. So we need to think a little about what does it mean for these people as well. Today's webinar focuses in particular on remote work, but we have seen evidence that there are really progressive organizations out there thinking differently for everybody, maybe offering extra time off, maybe offering extra financial support for people to find childcare. So there are some really progressive organizations thinking differently about this issue. In fact, in order to think smart around this issue, you need to think about work. How can you do your work differently? And if you can do remote work, can it be a triple win? When we talk about a triple win, we're talking about that it's good for you, good for getting your work done, and good for the colleagues and clients that you work with. What we're going to hear today is it's also about what's happening at home. Do you have young children at home? Will the care that they currently are using be available? So we're going to talk about that today too. And it depends on your workplace. Some workplaces are much further along on these issues than others. In fact, for a long time now, if you've been part of the Thursday webinars, you'll have heard some of our amazing leaders. Chris Madhu is also one of our amazing leaders. You can go to that place on their website and hear Chris's story. He also ran a remote team, one of the first in his organization, and it shows you when you listen to Chris's story how this is an opportunity where people can work better when they're supported to think in a way about how to do work and have time for their lives. Chris's remote team actually was one of the best sales teams for 3 years in a row, in large part because Chris is a great manager and he could think in a smart way around work-life integration. So there really are some great answers out there. In fact, when I reached out to my community about who was doing some impressive things around the coronavirus, I wasn't surprised to hear back from Ben Applegate. He's one of the long-term supporters of ThirdPath as well, His organization is a law firm that's always been trying to think differently around these issues. And although somebody from Applegate couldn't join us today, they sent us this great email that showed how much they are already ready for what's coming their way. So if there's one thing you take away from today's webinar, there's a bunch of organizations that already get it. They're already smart. They already have been thinking about remote work. They're already planning in advance around how to handle things for their employees. And it's no surprise that Ben's one of them, because back in the 2008 economic crisis, Ben was a real pioneer in thinking differently about the needs of his employees. He lost about 40% of his business in one quarter and didn't want to lose some of his valuable employees. So this is a case study we wrote up about Ben Applegate and how he basically thought about how he could reorganize things from top to bottom in his organization to make it through the economic crisis and still hold on to his top performers. And by doing so, he knew he'd be ready for when the economy improved and that it would be good for everybody's morale. So I hope Ben provides us some ideas about how we can best manage this crisis as well. Rob, you're a great example of someone who's been thinking way ahead of the curve on how we can do work differently. And boy, is it going to come in handy as we manage the next 3 to 6 months of this very uncharted waters around the coronavirus. Tell us a little about how you first launched this remote team. What were some of the challenges you faced? And then bring us up to date. Where is it? How is it today? Is it something that's still being embraced? Is it embraced yet in your organization? So tell us a little history about how this all got started, Rob.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. It really, it's been a part of my team for going on 10 plus years, and really, from what I can remember how it started, it was just a team member that approached me that wanted the consideration, and one thing led to another, and really ultimately without leadership support that this company provides, it's really not possible to do remote work. But fortunately, I work for a company here at Brinker International that the leadership is fully engaged and on board with that. They realize, as you mentioned, it's a win-win-win for all three different levels. The team member has the flexibility to, log off of an evening and they're done and they can be there for their kids immediately or back on if they need to. And my particular group, I've got a team of 13 that all participate in the remote work. And, they are very experienced. I have very low turnover, and obviously for the company, that's a huge win.
Yes. Yeah. I think you might have mentioned at one time that you have some metrics about how well the team performs too, because that's one of the things that people kind of question, like, gee, when people are home, are they really getting their work done? Or are they distracted by whatever is going on at home? Do you have you been able to show other people at your workplace some of the metrics that prove that this approach is working well for the organization work-wise?
Correct. Fortunately, what my team does, we're really a one-point contact for all our mini restaurants. We have over 1,000 restaurants that we are responsible for. So we're kind of their one-stop shop when it comes to their accounting questions. And so, I reach out to the restaurants, and I get nothing but praise about the customer service that my team is able to provide. And when you're dealing with restaurant operations, as you can probably imagine, you've got a few hours during the day where they're busy with lunch. You don't want to bother them, and then they're back in the afternoon doing back office type stuff. So I get nothing but praise on feedback and above the line cards from my team. So definitely so.
Yeah. And when you look at where you are today around the advice from the CDC and a bunch of other places that remote work is going to be an excellent solution for how we handle the coronavirus, do you kind of like, sigh a big relief because you've already got this all set up? Has this been a conversation you've had with some of your team members or other leaders at your organization?
Right, absolutely. We're we're prepared. I've had a particular team member that's had to go out of state and take care of some, an elderly parent. So, I've had situations where we've kind of already had to instill something like this, put it in place, and it's really going to be fairly seamless if it's something where we have to be 5 days, 5 days at home. So,
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. And is this something you've experimented with yourself? And what do you think about it personally, remote work?
I do take advantage of it as well. I only work at home 1 day a week versus all my team members do at least 2-3 days at home. But being a supervisor, it's just there's a need to be in the office a little bit more. But yes, I definitely find myself more productive when I'm at home, less interruptions.
Yeah, and I think what we're going to hear about next, Rob, is you're a great example of if you've even had 1 day a week experience about remote work, it's going to make the transition to what could happen around the coronavirus so much simpler because you know how to work remotely. You have done,
yes.
You've set up systems at home to allow you to do this. And so just encouraging employees to at least do remote work once a week or, on a regular basis in some capacity means that when we have, these kinds of changes or, bad weather or all kinds of other stuff, you've already set up good systems in place to help people better manage that. So that's what I want to talk about next. There's a really wonderful article. Callie Williams-Yost does a lot of work around these kinds of issues, and there's a great article in Harvard Business Review where she talks about how to get your organization ready for what might be coming around the corner of really needing to do 100% remote work for as many employees as possible as a way to slow down the potential risk of the coronavirus. And so she points out a couple of things in the article, and what was interesting is that, again, these are all things that Rob's already doing because he has personally done remote work and he has a team that's already doing remote work. So, if there's another big takeaway from today's webinar, the more you can do this stuff now, even a month before you have to get more fully remote later, try some of this stuff now because it's going to help you. So when you have people work remotely, my hunch is that they get pretty smart about how to use technology and maybe even are more interested in using new technologies to make it work well. Has that been your experience that their technology, they're very motivated to learn about how technology can help remote work well? Has that been your experience with your team?
Oh yes, absolutely. And they actually teach me a lot of things from a technology standpoint that
yep.
They learn. And I mean, we have the capability of sharing screens through our Ring Central VoIP phone system. So even working remotely, we can share screens and see what each other's looking at.
Yeah. So I think there's this real case, again, encouraging people to think about remote work sooner than later helps people learn some new technologies that will make these kinds of transition work better for everybody. What Callie said, though, in a crisis situation, when you suddenly have a bunch of people working remotely who are not used to it, she said one of the things that can happen is people feel afraid to interrupt each other. They think, oh, he's working at home, I shouldn't interrupt him. Rob, what have you learned around that, around staying connected and being able to reach out to each other? What are some tips you've learned as a remote working team to keep each other connected?
I have a hard time with that because I think with my team, they definitely lean on each other a lot, from that perspective. And it's been something I often remind my team that I don't want other teams to feel, it should be transparent within the organization that we're working at home. I mean, Brinker has other teams that work at home, but I don't want other teams to feel pain points because we have team members at home and they're not at home. So
yeah, I had the same response. I have a completely virtual organization. It's been virtual for 20 years, and we all work slightly different schedules, but we have very carefully created an overlap in our schedules. And my feeling is, we have a pretty straightforward way to connect with each other when we need to get a hold of each other when we're all working. So you're right. I think it's more that if you're used to seeing people face to face to interrupt them, you forget that you can just call them up, you can text them, you can whatever. There really
Correct.
isn't any reason why you can't reach somebody. Yeah, I agree. Great. How about this one? She said, it's important to find ways to prioritize work and do regular check-ins. Certainly that's something we've learned at ThirdPath. We have regular one-on-one meetings. We use something we call biweekly updates, where each employee can update me about how they're working on their top priority tasks and how it's moving forward. Have you learned systems where you can keep track of how work is being prioritized and moving forward? What are some tips you've learned around that, Rob?
Oh, I think it's just to second that. It's check-ins with the team members one-on-one that enables you to do that. And then we still have a once a week weekly team meeting that if we need to create a Ring Central phone number for folks to call in, that's great. But for the most part, that's one day a week that my team's here at the office, and so we can all kind of check back in with each other and make sure everything's going smoothly.
Yeah. And I don't know if you guys were listening in today and you heard what Rob said. I think it's a really creative solution he's come up with. Assuming everybody stays healthy and it can continue as normal, right. He uses Wednesdays as the day that everybody comes into the office and they all check in and have meetings, and that's a nice thing for 1,000 reasons. Obviously, it's good for helping people be clear about priority of work, but it's also what we've learned is in a virtual workplace or when people are working remotely, having some time where you spend together physically is also important. So I think you found a nice rhythm where people can work separately but also work in a connected way. Obviously, that might shift temporarily.
Right.
But
right.
You have lots of experience with being able to do that over the phone, it sounds like, too.
Yes. No, I think, in the scenario that could possibly come up, I think it would still be important to set up, if not a weekly, but at least, every so often check-in on the phone that everybody can call in to a number and we can just kind of have this discussion and just make sure everything's going okay. So.
Yeah. We definitely have found that for us, the cadence has been once a month. We have a staff meeting. And interestingly, on our staff meetings, we start them by talking about something called a new and good from work and life. And so our staff meetings begin with a picture of our families where people talk a little bit about something new and good from the work side and from the family side as a way to kind of build that sense of teamwork. Again, we're 100% virtual, so it's something we've learned to do because you have to balance people working separately but also feeling connected. It seems like you found a good way to do that, Rob. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, Callie talked about something next. Again, this isn't a crisis solution where you've had an organization that hasn't had much experience with remote work. Suddenly people are working remotely because that's the best way to handle the potential of people really needing to not congregate in the workplace because of the coronavirus. And she talks about forgive imperfect workspaces. Let me explain that, and then I'm curious to hear what you have to say. Ideally, because Rob's been doing for 10 years a remote team with 13 people, all 13 people have figured out how to create a great workspace for themselves at home that's away from distraction. So they don't have the kids walking in, they don't have the dog barking in the background. They figured out how to create a place where they can focus and get their work done. And if they're on a conference call, that the noise in the background, is not going to be unprofessional. So that's something remote workers do when they're working remotely, is they figure out how to create a distraction-free workspace for themselves. But what she's pointing out is suddenly you might have people who are working remotely who haven't figured out how to do that. Is that true that your team has figured out how to create a better workspace for themselves? And do you think you've learned anything around some suggestions for people around how to do that that you could share with us? What are your thoughts about that workspace idea?
I'll say for myself personally, I just think it's key to have a consistent workspace at home. I just think in the beginning when I was doing it, I found that if I was, switching locations or whatnot, that didn't work as well as once I really honed in on where I wanted that workspace to be. And it's not a perfect set aside room, office, desk, all that, but it's still a quiet space, and I can focus and get my work done. So.
Yeah. I noticed when my kids went from being really young to a little bit older and they could walk around on their own, I moved my office from my second floor to my third floor because
Right.
they were home, I was home, and I didn't need them. They'd come in and ask a question, and it kind of got me off track. And so we learned moving me a little further away helped me have a little bit more focus.
I agree.
Well, the last point being, I think one of my favorite points that Callie talks about is, okay, imagine suddenly we have these organizations that are trying to go from 0 to 60 on remote work. They don't have your 10-year experience. And so they have these people who are working from home. Maybe that's happening for 2 or 3 months. Let's hope it's not too long. But they set up some sort of a solution so that employees can work remotely to handle getting through the coronavirus and lowering the risk of transferring the virus from one person to the other. So here they are, 0 to 60, suddenly a lot of remote work happening. She said, this is an opportunity to learn a lot about how to create a more flexible work culture. What's working? What's not working? You could put a simple SurveyMonkey survey together and have people fill in 3 questions about what's working, what's not working, and then gather that information so that after this experience, you have some ideas about how maybe you can continue to offer flexibility in a way that works well for people and gets rid of some of the problems that might have been encountered. Are there any problems that you remember as you've gone over the years of trying to make remote work well that you think would be worth sharing with people today, or any tips around how to make remote work best? What do you think, Rob?
I can't think of anything just off the top of my head. I will say I know the phones can be a challenge. In the beginning of our time, we were on a different phone system. So I think what's going to be the most difficult task for the organizations will be technology. And I think as long as you've got the technology IT support, then I think everything should be okay. So I'm sorry, I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
That's actually the one that Callie came up with. In fact, if you look at point number 1, she said, don't wait for the point when you send everybody home to see if technology is working. Go ahead and try some experiments now. See if you can make sure the phones are working, the technology is working. Don't adopt new technologies in the middle of all this either. Just try to see if the existing technologies that people are familiar with are going to start working, and so that you're ahead of the curve for 2 months from now if you do need people to start working remotely, or a month from now if you need people to work remotely. Rob, this is fabulous. Real life experience of a real life manager with a real life remote team. Thank you so much. I am going to circle back to you in a minute, but I promised everybody we'd talk about how work redesign is only half the solution. The other solution is what's happening at home. So I asked Melissa Davison to join us today. She's the parent of 2 young children, and so she's been thinking a lot about what will happen as she looks ahead around how maybe schools will be closed. Maybe her child care provider won't be available. How will she and Brian make it work around balancing both of their work responsibilities? So Melissa, I'm going to have you talk in general about what you've been learning. And one of the things we talked about was it's a little bit about what the kind of work Melissa does and a little bit about the kind of work that Brian does. So where are we on thinking about this, Melissa? Tell us.
Thanks for having me on, Jessica. This is because we've been working as a shared care family or moving into that for a while. I think it might be less of a hurdle for us than it may be for other families. We do, as you said, I work for ThirdPath, so I'm completely remote. We have a home office. Brian actually works from home 1 day a week and has for as many years as we've been married. It's over 10 years he's had a work from home day. What's interesting in this situation is the university that he works at, he works in the IT department, so he does have the remote work capability. And the university that he works at, they've got a great employee relations department and infrastructure set up already for telework. That all plays very nicely to what we might need. I think it's important to talk about, I've been part of the ThirdPath community for over 5 years, even though I've only been an employee for a year and a half. So we've worked really hard together as a couple to talk about what shared care looks like for us. And it's part of our regular conversation to talk about how we're managing childcare. I think you're probably going to talk about with kids who are aged 2 and 6, when people are home, we don't get an opportunity to say, here's a screen, go entertain yourselves while we work. This is pretty constant supervision that we need in our house. So we do need somebody available when the kids are here. So we're already managing school vacations, summer vacations, sick days. The difference in this scenario is if we're looking at a longer term school closure that we weren't planning on, that changes the complexion of our solution a little bit.
Yeah, and you told me something that Brian said that was music to my ears. That's a real example of how you've been working for many years to think about things together as a team at home. What was that thing that Brian said?
It was 2 nights ago, as we're looking at, what might be coming, and Brian talking about what the picture might be looking like for him at work. And he said, and please don't worry, I've already been thinking about and talking to my boss about the fact that if schools close, I need to be part of the care team at home as well. And I just like you, I
Wow.
was really thrilled that it wasn't something, I'm primarily home. I only work part-time, he's full-time. I do take a lot of the childcare responsibilities on because of the nature of the work hours that we both have. But it really was wonderful to not be the driver of that conversation, that we've been practicing this long enough that that was front of mind for Brian, as things are really moving at a very rapid pace for him in the IT department at a major university. And so for that to have been part of his thought process was really wonderful, and makes it a lot less stressful at our house right now.
Yes, yes. Because ultimately, what we're trying to say is that, when you think about these solutions, we need to be remembering that it's not just work that has to change. There might need to be some changes at home, and that they need to do some scenario planning, and that, when you have both parents, whether they're, divorced or together, both parents thinking about how they can be involved with thinking about how work might change and how care might change, it really expands the opportunities. And if you read our most recent newsletter, really, I think what we're trying to say is, I try to help people understand there's such an opportunity for us to think differently about work and home and create lives that feel so in line with what our values are. Unfortunately, the coronavirus is teaching us the stick side of it. Watch out. We got to be careful here. And the fear I have is if we only solve this still from women figuring out how to flex it, we're really reinforcing some strong gender norms that caregiving is still just a woman's issue and need to be solved by the moms. And so when I heard Melissa and Brian doing such great work as a team, it really was, I felt, an important part of the conversation we wanted to have today. I'm going to put up one more slide, Melissa, because one of the things we try to talk about at ThirdPath is that, you're in that middle category, balancing children and career. But, wherever you are, this is an opportunity for us to really think differently. And Rob, for example, talked about an employee who has an elderly parent. That's the population that's going to be most impacted by the coronavirus. So there's caregiving and, needs for flexibility at all stages of our lives. But I want to give Melissa a little bit more time to talk about, it is a little challenging when you have very young ones at home who you can't just have go off and do their own thing. And you're trying to imagine how you're going to make it work if, for example, school changes. what are some ideas that you and Brian have thought about that, in your scenario planning that feel like they might help you from a work, family, team at home lens?
That's such a good question. Yeah, I think we're still playing that out right now, but I think some of what we've talked about has to do with we would each have set work hours so that there would still be uninterrupted time for whoever's working, and the expectation that the other person is completely on call with the kids. We've also talked about we both have the luxury of being able to do some of our work in the evening and on the weekends. So we've talked about using some non-traditional hours where we can. In our house, if there's no school, it's like a weekend day because of the ages of our kids. So we do get to kind of practice this pretty frequently.
Yeah.
If somebody's home from school, that the weekdays look just like the weekends. So for us, it's a 7-day a week game. It's not just a 5-day a week game for caring for the children. So it's setting the work hours and giving the working individual the quiet time in the office with the door closed, that we just know, pretend you're not here. You're here, but pretend you're not here.
Yeah, yeah. And I love, and if you're listening in again, so Melissa's just kind of very intuitively thought about ways to make it work. In the worst case scenario, that schools are closed, they're trying to get work done and care for 2 young children who need their attention. What Melissa's learned, because she's been practicing this for so many years, and so has Brian, by the way. He's had a work at home day forever. What she's talking about is that, she and Brian are discussing creating some time where they have absolutely focused work time because somebody else is in charge of the kids, meaning the other parent. And they figured out how they might be able to do that because they expand the work week. Because of the kind of work they do, they could do it in the evenings or on the weekends. And so, again, we're not saying this is the ideal solution for the rest of their lives, but this is a way that they could figure out how to get their work done effectively and still manage the responsibilities at home. Big lesson here, creating a team at home is not something that happens overnight. This is something they've been working on and working on. We're sorry that some of you might be discovering this issue because of a crisis, the coronavirus. But Melissa, what's the positive of creating a team at home? Tell us some of the advantages if they invest in this team at home approach.
Oh, you and I have talked so much about how it's a muscle that you have to first develop, and then we've really flexed the muscle so many times that the conversation, which at the beginning, when I first started to talk about, I need a little bit more support at home. Could you shift your hours so that I could have some time to do some things that are important to me? Those conversations were hard at the beginning, and now it's part of our practice as a couple and as a family to have these conversations. So the more you flex that muscle, the easier it is to pull together when you need to revisit the plan and make some course adjustments. That just gets easier with time.
Yeah, because I guess what we've been preaching at ThirdPath is it never stops changing. So you keep on needing to figure out something because work changes, children change. In fact, we're going to segue into Rob. Thank you, Melissa, for sharing that. And I know that you might not be able to stay for the whole webinar, but you're welcome to stay as long as you can. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
All right. So Rob, I'm sure some of this sounds pretty familiar about this team at home approach. Many of our listeners have heard your story from a different lens. We've talked about Michelle Hickox and how she negotiated a flex year schedule where she had summers off when your children were young. But if you're listening in today and seeing that lovely picture, those are his kids today. So they are not young. They are young adults. When you listen to Melissa and the conversations she and Brian are having as they manage 2 jobs and constant change of work and families, does it bring back some memories and any thoughts about creating a team at home that you want to share, Rob?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Teamwork and communication. Those are, communication is so huge. And just the number of times you get that phone call from school or the school nurse and somebody's not feeling well, and you just work as a team and communicate on who can go take care of the children at that point. So yes, absolutely. Communication. It takes a while to work through it. But Michelle, when she organized that summer flex year schedule that she had, it was great for our family that she could spend time with the girls at home over the summer, but yet still be available for work if needed. But I just think for her to be there for them as a role model through the summers, we've been blessed on how our daughters have grown up. So.
Yeah, and Rob's being shy about the role he played. He was the one who actually would pick up the kids most days from childcare around 4 o'clock and have them until dinner time when Michelle got home. And then Michelle had very, very busy tax seasons. So Rob did the lion's share of home stuff during Michelle's tax season. So they have a really long-term teamwork that they've created for themselves that's, I think, pays off in a very healthy relationship. One last thought, Rob. When you think about, and we're going to talk more about this on the Father's Day webinar because we're lucky to have Rob and 2 other male leaders who followed this path on a call with us on Father's Day. But when you think about how this has maybe shaped you as a father and the connection you have with your daughters, any thoughts about how it might be the role you've played with them so hands-on maybe shaped a different relationship than you might have expected with your daughters?
Oh, yes. I think, as you mentioned, what worked well for us from an arrangement standpoint is Michelle, I got into work fairly early. Michelle would get the girls to school, and then I would handle the after school routine, evening, and all that. But I just think for the time spent with the girls during all those evenings, I just think it absolutely strengthened our relationship, and I really believe to this day that it was a result of being there for them and spending that time with them after school that built that relationship.
Yeah. No, it's a really powerful thing that you don't know is happening as it's happening, but when you look back, I bet it's even shaped. Honestly, Rob, it's probably shaped who they're looking for to spend their lives with, too. So you've done something pretty amazing there, Rob. You're really modeling something for the long run in a very different way. Wow. Well, I knew this was going to be a great call. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but one of the big things we've learned when you have people like Rob encouraging teams like he's been encouraging, and you have people like Melissa, they are learning some different skills around how to work better in a world where you could work all the time, everywhere. They've developed what we call some integration skills. And if you tune in next month, we have 2 really amazing leaders who have followed this integrated approach their entire careers, and we're going to talk more about these skills and then how these skills then help them become the kind of leader who could support a team to work in a more flexible way. So make sure to come back in a month, too. Delta, you've been listening in. You know this stuff personally. You know this stuff as a manager. But today, we're going to get a chance to hear you talk about how does this play out for organizations. But I think you had a couple of points you wanted to make first. So tell us what you want to tell us, Delta.
Oh, thanks, Jessica. I appreciate having the chance to be on. And kudos to you for pivoting on this and approaching this from the coronavirus perspective while it's the thing of the moment for folks that are listening to this. I'm looking at this, I'm kind of the downer because I'm going to look in some ways back at the more practical aspects of this as opposed to some of the things that you've just been exploring, which are also near and dear to my heart. But I have to say, when the coronavirus thing popped up, it really took me back, deja vu, because our company at the time, I was working for Ryan LLC. It's a corporate tax advisory firm that's based in Dallas and is global. And in 2008, we had made the decision, we've been working on it for a while, to move into a work anywhere, anytime environment where people could do that as long as they got the results. It took us a while to get ready for that and to prepare for it. But just as we launched it, May of 2008, the recession was rearing its head, and we were deciding, do we go forward or not? And we did. And after we moved forward with it, the pandemic, the H1N1, the influenza pandemic hit. And one of the things we discovered early on is that there was the work that we had done really set us up well for what was happening. We knew it at the time because we were working on what some people call disaster recovery, business resumption, business continuity. I'd worked on that in another company as well. So there's a lot that goes on technically, as Rob well knows, behind the scenes to be ready for that. But we realized that what we were doing was equipping our people to go remote, because we had to look at so many things we hadn't looked at before with brick and mortar, really did play into that. So it was going on. It was serendipitous for us. But I will say on the front end of this that a couple of things. One, fully recognize that people listening to this, there are different sizes of business, different types of business, those that are in retail, consulting, service. That all plays into how this looks. It's not a cookie cutter for how they can make it work in this particular environment we're in right now. There's also role reality, what people can work remotely, which ones do need to be physically present. There's just a lot of different things that come into play. And two others that I think of as well, there are HR compliance matters that have to be considered for many companies related to how time is kept for hourly workers, how this works for how you're going to handle everything correctly and remain compliant in that environment. Technology helps a lot with that. And then finally, just when you're remote or when you're not, how do you measure results? Do you know if a person is being effective? One thing I will say, and it was something that was alluded to earlier, is that mindset that has to be there. And Rob mentioned that as well, the supportive leadership. If a leadership mindset is you're only working when I can see you, and there's not trust in that respect, it can be really difficult to make this happen. So I have a chart that's I like to share that I try to just kind of do a brain dump for the things that came to the top of my mind, Jessica, when you asked me to think about this, that really were forefront with us. And many of these have already been mentioned. But when I started writing this down, I thought, okay, I'm thinking from the company perspective, but let me put another side of this. We've talked about the individual side of it in another way, but when you look at this, nearly every one of these hits both companies and individuals in those companies in one way or another. For example, technology. Obviously, a company has to make sure that people are equipped to work well. I know at Ryan, what we discovered when we started, and again, we weren't in crisis mode, but we discovered that several of our offices lacked the bandwidth that they needed to allow all of their teams to work remotely because they had to access servers that contained data that had to be dealt with. And so we had to do things like that. And so we were ready, obviously, when the pandemic occurred in 2009, a year later. On the individual side, if I'm in a family, I have to figure out, okay, do we all have our cell phones up and running appropriately? Do we have contacts that are loaded in that we need so we can get in touch with each other quickly and see who's calling versus just having a number out there without a name attached to it? What technology do we as a family need? Communication and meetings within the company was a huge piece for us when we decided to go remote, making sure that people had what they needed to conduct those meetings and they knew how to use the tools. There's so many tools now, Zoom and GoTo and Ring and everything else, that it's great if you have them, that they've got dust on them, and some people haven't been trained. If you have to go live with it, it can put them at a disadvantage. On the individual side, with families, how are you going? What are your communication protocols? What if your school shuts down, goes on lockdown? What if your environment that you're in, if you're in a company where suddenly there's a need to quarantine because of something that happens there, how are we going to be in touch with each other? So that happens on both sides of the equation. Event cancellations, companies, I'm working with a lot of my clients over the last week or so. We've been working on things like this and how do we communicate with our employees and what are we doing? But individuals too, what have we got on our schedule that might need to look different or not happen at all? With companies, it turns into virtual events. I'm tied to a group right now that has a huge event coming up in Denver that has had to be canceled. They made that decision and it's turning into a virtual event, and it's a little rough around the edges, but they're making it happen. Sanitation and cleanliness, both sides of the equation, companies now are making sure that they're doing what they have to do and can do to make things cleaner. At Ryan, we decided during pandemic that we ticked it up a bit on how our cleaning service, what they were required to use. We also put together kits for our folks that included for everybody with a workstation, hand wipes and things they could wipe down their doorknobs and such with, tissues, things like that. And then that translated into a standard items in our onboarding kits afterwards. Policies in the company have to be looked at. What things might need to be tweaked so that we don't freak people out because they're trying to abide by a policy that no longer is workable. Same thing in a family or with individuals. What are our family ground rules that we need to look at and perhaps make some changes? On a company side, benefit tweaks. We've heard a lot in the news about companies that are dropping co-pays and things like that. There's so many things that can be done to enhance, if you can do it financially, recognizing there's some very small companies, some very large companies where this looks different. But just take a look at those benefits and see what you might be able to do. It might even be just communicating clearly to your employees what they have that they don't know they have. Teledoc, for example, as opposed to going into an office where you're exposed to others, making sure they know how to use that and that they have it. And on the individual side, making sure you get educated about what you've got. If it's not being explained to you or you're rusty, just bring yourself current. Travel has to be considered both sides, with companies and with individuals, making sure that what are we going to do? I'm on a McKinsey and Company Advisory Board and learned from them what they're doing, and it's a very thoughtful, proactive approach to being considerate of individuals, being considerate of clients, making sure that it works for everyone. On the food side, I first just had that on the family side, the individual side, but making sure we're all probably stocking up and a little bit of a panic here. But on the company side, what if you have a quarantine in your company where you literally have to keep people in place? Do you have any type of shelf life food that's available and water and things like that readily available so that you could sustain for a bit? Something to think about. And general supplies, things that you need to keep going as a family. I mean, we've heard about the run on things like as basic as toilet paper, but business supplies and things like that, toner for your cartridges and things like that. And then a big one, finances on both sides. Companies have to meet payroll. They have a lot of things that are happening with 401k matches and expenses and everything that I'm sure that Rob could probably tell us what he's thinking in that regard, but those are things that have to be proactively considered. And on the individual side as well, how are we going to make our way through this? People who are living close to the vest would have some issues to think about there as well. And then another huge one, especially on the company side, but for sure in a family unit, roles and responsibilities, just like Melissa and her husband have thought through how we're going to work this out, who's on point for what. In a company, it's so critical, not just waiting for this point in time, but who's responsible for what, when does it have to happen and where, who has to be brick and mortar, who can completely work remotely, who do we have in our company that is the only person that knows how to do something that's critical? How do we handle that? Do we have a backup? Do we need a backup? Should we have one going forward? And individuals and families as well. And then finally, there's a lot more to it than this. These are the things that came top of mind for me. But I think post-crisis, what's already been mentioned, Kelly Yost and others have talked about this as well. It's just like, to me, the metaphor is we go to the doctor to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves. Most of us do typically, but sometimes there are those situations where a heart attack occurs, a crisis occurs, and someone then goes on a diet, does exercise to get where they need to be to sustain their good health. They get there, and then they get back into those old habits. The same thing can happen to us as a company as well. Companies can get past this crisis and then go, well, okay, back to normal. But I suggest that the learnings are there, not just around remote work, but about some of these basics, like why should we just do a really good job of cleaning the workplace? Why should we as individuals just wash our hands really well during this crisis? How about if we sustain that ongoing? And that's one of the things from post-crisis. Look at what's happened and what you've learned. Figure out what practices you need to preserve. What do you need to memorialize for sure, so that if this happens again, you've got that business resumption or business sustainability plan in place. And what can you sustain easily that makes sense, just as good common sense as an individual or company going forward? So I really appreciate the fact that this has been focusing on both the individual and the family piece of it and the company side. It is something that there can be a win-win if we're thinking about it in that way. But if I could only say one thing about it all, I would really stress that point. What you learn in this crisis, what you put in place that can carry forward, don't let it die, and figure out how to preserve it and sustain it.
Wow, Delta, I thank you very much for sharing this excellent list and really underscoring the connection between what we can do individually and as organizations. And the most important takeaway on the list, you're absolutely right, is what do we learn in the crisis that we can carry forward with us? And it seems like, the story in the background of what Ryan went through, you literally preserved, memorialized, and sustained so much that you learned going with the project that you were rolling out at a time that was, could have been very challenging, but really ended up being something that set you up to manage that crisis better. So wonderful. I want to underscore a couple of the ones that Delta talked about, and then we're going to be close to wrapping up. I will give people a last word, but I do think, that there's some really important, one just jumps to my mind about how we can think outside the box here of organizations where you can get employees to join together. And if someone's short on paid time off, they can actually create a pool of paid time off to help each other. So there really are some ways we can think smarter. Again, on our webinar next month and some of our past webinars, one of the things we've really seen around finances is, or for couples to think ahead about how do we make it affordable. For example, maybe making some big decisions that are going to keep a lot more flexibility around time. So these are things to think about, yes, for the virus that's coming our way, but these are lifetime good things to think about as well. Thank you. That's awesome. So where I want to go next is to give people a chance to say a last word, and then we're going to do some Q&As where if someone has a question for any of our participants today, you can ask them directly or in general. Maybe, I don't know if Melissa's still here. If she is, I will ask her if she has a last thought she wants to share. And after that, I'll ask Rob if he has a last shot he wants to share. Melissa, are you still with us?
I am. The last thought that I want to share is just you have to not be afraid to ask for what you need. I think sometimes it can't just be incumbent on an organization to make offers, but if you've had a conversation at home or you've just been thoughtful about what you need personally, it's important to flesh that out and take the risk to ask.
Yeah. And which brings us, actually, we're still figuring out what's going to happen, whether it's going to turn into a virtual event or the original face-to-face event, April 30th. So stay tuned for us as we figure this out. But, one of the big messages at the Integrated Life Advocate Forum that we have on April 30th, whether it's virtual or face-to-face, is the idea that if you don't ask, the answer is no. So how do you get the courage? And that's what we'll be looking at the ILA Forum, is how do you get the courage to ask for what you want? And hopefully it's not just to get you through the coronavirus, but it's to live the life you want. And we have a great event for you to learn more about that. Rob, you might have a last thought you want to share, and then we'll hear from Delta. And then after we hear from them, we'll go to the live Q&A. Rob, any last thoughts?
My last thought is, I mentioned earlier how critical teamwork is from a home perspective with parenting children, but I also want to just add that from a work team perspective, teamwork is going to be critical, especially in a crisis situation like this. That if the team can help each other through it, then that's just a major point.
Yeah, no, that's something we are fond of saying at the Third Path. Team at home, team at work. That's what makes it work. So thank you. That's great. Delta, again, thank you for your excellent list. Any last thoughts you want to share before we go to the live Q&A?
I guess one that I would stress is that of the importance of really being self-assessing if you're a leader, manager in an organization, and everybody's a leader in their families, but definitely in a corporation, you need to look at in the mirror and say, how do I really feel like people are only working if I can see them? And if so, that's something to work on, and recognize that your mindset is going, even if you have policies that your company has allowed you to enact that give some flexibility, if you truly are not bought into that, it's going to show in your behaviors. And it's really important to work toward understanding how this can work by understanding yourself really well and understanding the impact of those subtle things that you do and say, and the modeling that you've got going on that could cause people to feel really comfortable or feel mistrusted and nervous.
Yeah. Wow, that is a powerful way to close today's webinar. Let's all think about how we're modeling what we believe in, especially if we are leaders. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and please stay tuned for the live Q&A.